In 1979, global oil consumption per capita peaked, and even to this day, almost 50 years later, it has never again fully recovered. This is an especially shocking statistic when you stop to realize that the average person living on Earth today is 500% more economically productive than they were back then. In plain English, what this means is that since the year 1980, our global economy has become 6 times more fuel efficient. Which sounds great, but come on, you already know it wasn't diligent long-term planning or environmental conscientiousness that got us here. It was an economic shock so severe that it literally reshaped the global economy. The oil crisis of the late 70s and early 80s was kicked off by a rapid succession of protests and regime change in Iran, which was quickly followed by full-scale war across the region. The fighting destroyed infrastructure and slowed oil exports destined for countries in the West that had become very accustomed to having easy energy on demand. Prices more than doubled within just a few months, and as people panicked to get their hands on fuel for their cars, rationing was introduced across the world. But cutting off the circulation of oil also impacted far more than just the morning commute in 1970s land yachts. It was a massive shock to global industry that relied on oil to power their machinery, fuel their trucks, and produce their chemicals. All of these costs were eventually passed along to consumers, resulting in some of the highest rates of inflation ever seen in advanced economies in modern history. Not to mention the most severe economic downturn between the GFC and the Great Depression. The impacts of what was ultimately a short and not even particularly major disruption in global oil supplies would also go on to echo throughout the decades that followed, directly impacting things like the savings and loans crisis of the early 1990s and, of course, the wider global industrial landscape of today. And, well, yeah, that hinted at perhaps the biggest irony of all in this story. At the height of the greatest oil crisis in history, total oil production was down by less than 5% worldwide. Once again, proving that learning from history is easy until there is a profit to be made from ignoring it.
Sum up in the word of one irate motorist, the first day of the odd-even system was a disaster.
For the first time since the war with Iran began, we've discovered that some South Florida gas stations are running out of fuel.
You can see the price of unleaded tonight is $73.9. That's high enough for any of us who can remember when premium was $27.9. But $73.9 is not as high as it's going to go.
The gallon of gas is higher than $4.
I've been in 2 gas lines already.
With war in the Middle East disrupting how the world gets its energy, the impact is being felt thousands of miles away.
This is unreal. Isn't this disgusting? Why doesn't anybody contact the president? Why is he letting this happen to us?
Now, to understand how we got here, we need to understand just how dependent the world was on cheap oil when heading into the late 1970s. The world today still cannot function without a steady flow of the easy on-demand energy that comes from fossil fuels. But before the 1980s, this dependency was even greater, both for households and the wider economy. Cars at the time were enormously inefficient. The average American vehicle in the mid-1970s got somewhere around 13 miles per gallon, which for us metric people is roughly 18 litres per 100 kilometers. And nobody cared. Petrol was so cheap that fuel economy wasn't even a consideration when buying a car. Americans in particular had spent 2 decades falling in love with enormous V8 engines and land yacht sedans that weighed more than some small boats. The idea of buying a smaller car to save on fuel would have been genuinely laughable. We're talking about a country where the Cadillac Eldorado had a 500 cubic inch engine, the largest production that V8 ever made. It produced roughly 190 horsepower and got about 8 miles per gallon. And this dependency on massive fuel-inefficient vehicles became baked into the very structure of American society. The entire highway system had been built around the assumption that fuel would remain cheap and plentiful forever. Suburbs had been designed for car-based commuting, with residential areas situated miles away from employment centers and commercial districts. Without cheap petrol, the whole suburban model started to become economically unsustainable. But it wasn't just cars. The whole world had truly embraced petrochemicals. Heavy industry was a far bigger share of overall GDP than it is today, where services and technology have largely taken over. Everything from manufacturing to agriculture to power generation was built around the assumption that oil would remain cheap and plentiful basically forever. Plastics, fertilizers, synthetic fabrics, pharmaceuticals, road surfaces, heating fuel, the list of things derived from or powered by oil was so long that most people didn't even realize how much of their daily life depended on it. Farmers needed oil for the tractors, oil-based fertilizer for the crops, and diesel for the trucks that took those crops to market. A factory needed oil to power its machinery, heat its buildings, and transport its finished goods. Even the food on our plates had been touched by oil at basically every step between the ground and your kitchen. And for a while, the assumption that cheap oil would last forever seemed pretty reasonable. But while the rest of the world was getting more and more addicted to oil, America's own domestic production had actually peaked back in the early 1970s and was on its way back down again. This is something called peak oil, and it's worth explaining briefly because it matters for the rest of this story. Oil production in any given region follows a rough bell curve. You find the easy stuff first, production climbs, and then as the reserves deplete, you have to drill deeper, work harder, and extract lower quality crude that costs more to refine. By the early 1970s, America had passed the top of that curve. Harder to extract, lower quality domestic crude was slowly being replaced by nice, cheap Middle Eastern oil. And nobody seemed particularly concerned about what might happen if that supply was ever disrupted. This is one of those things that is incredibly obvious in hindsight, but at the time, the logic sort of made sense. Why would you spend more money drilling for worse oil at home when you could buy better oil from abroad at a fraction of the price? Well, because it meant that you were handing a lot of economic leverage to a part of the world that had some very strong opinions about your foreign policy. But it wasn't just America. Western Europe was even more dependent on Middle Eastern oil than the United States was. Countries like France, Germany, and Italy imported the vast majority of their oil from the Persian Gulf region. And unlike America, they didn't even have significant domestic reserves to fall back on. This created an interesting transatlantic tension. America's foreign policy in the Middle East was shaped heavily by Cold War priorities and its relationship with Israel. But European countries, who were far more exposed to Middle Eastern oil supplies, often wanted a very different diplomatic approach. The energy dependency made everyone vulnerable, but it made them vulnerable in different ways. Now, if we are being completely accurate, the 1979 oil crisis was actually the second major oil disruption of the decade. The first happened in 1973, and it was tied directly to the Yom Kippur War. A group of oil-producing nations from the Arabian Peninsula attempted an embargo of oil shipments to countries that had supported Israel during the conflict. And well, it didn't really work. Financial historians have generously called the oil embargo a non-event because it was only conducted by a few countries on a few countries, so it was extraordinarily easy to get around. While the embargo itself wasn't all that effective in terms of actually cutting off supply, it sent a very clear signal about who had the leverage. That's because OPEC, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, watched this whole thing play out and realized something important. Oil prices adjusted for inflation had actually been falling since the end of the Second World War. The stuff was getting cheaper in real terms, but the countries sitting on top of the biggest reserves in the world were not getting their fair share of the value. So they did what any rational cartel would do. They raised prices. Since OPEC had enough market dominance to control the global supply, they were able to almost triple the price of oil worldwide, and there wasn't much anybody else could do about it. Now, it would be easy to frame this as simply greedy oil states trying to squeeze the West, but the reality is a lot more complicated than that. These were developing countries that had watched Western oil companies extract their most valuable natural resource for decades, and while paying them pennies on the dollar for the privilege. The price correction was overdue, even if the timing was terrible. The 1973 crisis did cause some economic pain, and it did serve as a warning about what could happen when your entire economy depends on energy you don't control. But the warning was largely ignored. Oil prices settled at their new higher levels. Some people grumbled about it, a few concerned voices pointed out that this could happen again. But the world adapted to the higher prices fairly quickly and went right back to consuming oil as if nothing had changed. Now, some governments did try to respond. The United States introduced a national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit to conserve fuel. President Nixon launched Project Independence, a grand plan aimed at achieving American energy self-sufficiency by 1980. Various conservation efforts were initiated across the developed world, but as soon as oil prices stabilized and the acute panic faded, all of those efforts largely fizzled out. The 55-mile-per-hour limit became a speed bump that drivers found ways around. Project Independence was quietly abandoned when the political will evaporated. The moment the immediate crisis wasn't staring everyone in the face, the world went back to business as usual. We've made videos before about how people and governments have a remarkable talent for ignoring warning signs when the alternative is inconvenient. And this was one of the better examples. But the first crisis was really just the warm-up act. The main event came in 1979. The second oil crisis is the one that most people remember, even though, in absolute terms, oil prices merely doubled compared to the near tripling from the first crisis. This time, the trigger wasn't an isolated and largely ineffective embargo. It was a revolution. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 ousted the Shah of Iran, a Western-backed authoritarian who had been keeping the country stable for decades, depending on your definition, and replaced him with the theocratic government that has ruled the country ever since. Now, the Shah's Iran had been one of the West's closest allies in the Middle East. America in particular had invested heavily in propping up his regime, providing military equipment, intelligence support, and diplomatic cover in exchange for reliable oil exports and a strategically positioned ally in the region. The problem was that a lot of ordinary Iranians absolutely despised the Shah. His secret police, known as Savak, were notorious for their brutality. Wealth inequality in the country was staggering, and the rapid westernization that the Shah had pushed was deeply unpopular with a large portion of the population. So when the revolution came, it came hard. Millions of people took to the streets. The Shah's military, one of the largest and most well-equipped in the region, thanks largely to American arms sales, initially tried to suppress the protests, but the scale of public anger was simply too great. By January of 1979, the Shah had fled the country and Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to establish the Islamic Republic. The speed of the collapse shocked Western intelligence agencies. The CIA had reportedly been telling the White House just months earlier that Iran was stable. It was one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the Cold War. But the revolution didn't just oust the Shah, it also created one of the most dramatic diplomatic ruptures in modern history. 52 American embassy staff were taken hostage and held for 444 days, becoming a constant reminder of the broken relationship between the United States and the new Iranian government. This hostage crisis consumed American attention, poisoned any chance of diplomatic negotiation over the oil situation, and made it essentially impossible to work towards any kind of peaceful resolution to the chaos engulfing the region. Iran at this time wasn't just any oil-producing country. It was one of the biggest exporters in the world, and its oil infrastructure was almost entirely managed through the National Iranian Oil Company, a state-owned enterprise that was itself the successor to the Western-owned Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Now, despite being a national oil company, NIOC was still largely managed by a consortium of for-profit oil companies back in the West at the time. Western engineers, Western managers, Western expertise running Iranian wells. This was a pretty common arrangement across the Middle East, and it tells you something important about how these relationships actually worked. The countries owned the oil on paper, but the knowledge of how to get it out of the ground efficiently was kept firmly in Western hands. So when the revolution happened, the new government nationalized the facilities and expelled the Western personnel working on them. Without this expertise, Iran struggled to maintain consistent production quality and output. Wells that had been running smoothly under foreign management were suddenly being operated by people who hadn't been trusted with the knowledge of how to do it properly, which is itself a pretty damning indictment of how colonial resource extraction tends to leave countries worse off even after they take back control of their own resources. And it wasn't just a management problem. No major international oil company was exactly lining up to do business with the same government that had just seized their infrastructure. Iran went from being one of the most integrated oil producers in the global market to being essentially cut off from it overnight. But the disruption didn't stop there. In September of 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, kicking off the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal 8-year conflict that further devastated oil infrastructure across the region. Between the two countries, millions of barrels of daily production capacity were taken offline as refineries were bombed, pipelines were destroyed, and shipping routes through the Persian Gulf became active war zones. The Iran-Iraq War is one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II, with estimates of over 1 million casualties combined. It gets remarkably little attention in the West relative to its scale, which probably tells you something about which wars we consider worth remembering. But what many people don't realize is that the war also involved a phase known as the Tanker War, where both Iran and Iraq targeted oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Commercial vessels carrying oil from other producers in the Gulf found themselves in the middle of a military conflict, with both sides attacking shipping indiscriminately. This made the Strait of Hormuz one of the most dangerous shipping routes in the world, and everyone transporting oil through it had to pay a war risk insurance premium on top of already elevated oil prices. Every barrel of oil that passed through that choke point was now carrying the literal cost of warfare built into its price. A fun little historical footnote in all of this: both the National Iranian Oil Company and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company are still around today. NIOC is still officially Iran's state oil company despite the rather dramatic shakeup in 1979. And the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, well, it changed its name a few times over the years, first to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, then to British Petroleum, or as we know it today, BP. So the next time you fill up at a BP station, just know that the company's origin story involves a lot more geopolitics than you might expect from a place that sells overpriced snacks and car washes. What was about to unfold in the Middle East would see Americans queuing for hours just to fill their tanks, Western governments scrambling to ration fuel, and an inflationary spiral so severe that it would eventually take the most aggressive monetary intervention in modern history to bring it under control. And by the time the dust settled, the entire political and economic landscape of the Western world had been permanently redrawn. So, it's time to learn how history works, and to see how a relatively small disruption in global oil supply managed to reshape the entire world economy. If you're not getting enough existential dread from these videos, Compounded Daily will blast it straight into your inbox every morning. It's a free business and money newsletter, and honestly, a better way to start the day than doom-scrolling Reddit, 50% more informative, 30% less catastrophizing. Sign up for free at compoundeddaily.com. Alright, so here's where this story takes a turn that's almost comically frustrating, because despite all of this chaos, the revolution, the war, the nationalization, the expelled engineers, global oil supplies did not actually fall that much. By most estimates, the total reduction in worldwide oil production was less than 4%. Other oil-producing countries simply ramped up their own output to take advantage of the higher prices. That's the thing about commodities. When prices go up, everybody with supply rushes to cash in. But it didn't matter. What followed was one of the most spectacular examples of collective panic in modern economic history. Everybody, from panicked motorists to major industrial companies to speculative traders, bought up whatever oil they could get their hands on, in anticipation of supply constraints and price increases that in many cases never actually materialized to the degree that people feared. Ironically, it was this panic buying that actually limited supply and drove prices through the roof. The crisis wasn't caused by a shortage of oil, it was caused by a shortage of confidence. In the United States, this played out in the most visible way possible. Lines at petrol stations stretched for blocks. Some stations ran out entirely and just closed. In states across the country, governments introduced odd-even rationing, meaning you could only fill up on certain days depending on whether your license plate ended in an odd number or an even number. There were fistfights at pumps. People started carrying siphon hoses in their cars. Petrol theft became so common that locking gas caps became a standard feature on new vehicles. In some cities, the National Guard was deployed to maintain order at filling stations. Gas station attendants started working behind locked doors. The price of oil had become a national security issue, playing out at the neighborhood level. News broadcasts every evening led with the price of oil in the same way they lead with the stock market today. It became the single metric that defined whether the country was doing well or doing badly. And for months, it was doing very badly indeed. And if that sounds dramatic for a 4% supply reduction, that's exactly the point. President Carter appeared on television urging Americans to turn their home thermostats down to 65 degrees Fahrenheit to conserve energy. Highway speed limits were enforced with unusual strictness, and traffic enforcement actually became a tool of energy policy. In some cities, petrol stations opened at 5 in the morning only to find queues of 200 plus cars, with the station's entire daily allocation sold out by 7 a.m. People were waiting 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours in line just to fill a tank. And that was if they were lucky enough to be there on the day when their license plate number was allowed to buy. But Even if the underlying supply disruption was relatively modest, the damage it caused was very real. Oil at this time wasn't just an important commodity, it was the commodity. It literally fueled every part of the economy, and this was especially true in the late 1970s, when heavy industry still dominated in a way that it simply doesn't anymore. So when the price of oil doubled, the price of basically everything else went up with it. Fuel for trucks meant more expensive deliveries, oil for factories meant more expensive goods. Petrochemicals for plastics and fertilizers meant higher costs across industries that most people don't even think about when they think about oil. And if that sounds familiar, it should. We've seen this exact same dynamic play out with everything from toilet paper to semiconductor chips in recent memory. Human nature doesn't change. It just finds new things to hoard and new supply chains to panic about. Now this is where the real economic damage started to compound, because workers at this time, and this part is important, still had strong union representation across most of the developed world. And those unions did exactly what they were supposed to do. They demanded higher wages to account for the higher costs of living, which is perfectly reasonable. Except businesses responded by raising their prices even further to cover the increased cost of paying their workers more. And because consumers had more money from the wage increases, businesses could actually get those higher prices because people could technically still afford to pay them. This created something called a wage price spiral, and it is one of the most terrifying feedback loops in all of macroeconomics. Prices go up, so wages go up, so costs go up, so prices go up, so wages go up, so costs go up. And the whole thing just keeps feeding itself with no natural endpoint. Now, you might be wondering, couldn't central banks have just stepped in and fixed all this? Well, they certainly tried. But the problem with a wage price spiral is that the standard tools of monetary policy are a bit like trying to put out a grease fire with water. It makes intuitive sense until you realize you're actually making it worse. Raising interest rates, the go-to move for fighting inflation, works by making borrowing more expensive, which slows down spending. But it also slows down businesses, which slows down hiring, which means fewer jobs, which means less spending power for the very workers whose wages were supposed to be keeping up with rising prices. Lower interest rates would help businesses hire more people, but it would also make borrowing easier, which would dump more money into an economy that was already overheating with inflation. There was no good option, only less bad ones. The result was something that most economists at the time believed was basically impossible: stagflation. High inflation and high employment and low economic growth, all at the same time. This was the macroeconomist's nightmare scenario. The conventional wisdom up to this point said that inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions, a relationship that economists had even given a name to, the Phillips curve. When prices are high, demand is high, so businesses hire more people. When unemployment is high, demand is low, so prices should fall. But the oil crisis broke that logic completely. Prices were being driven up not by strong demand, but by supply shocks and the panic that followed. There was no extra demand to create jobs, just extra costs destroying them. For ordinary people, this was devastating. Your groceries cost more, petrol costs more, your heating bill costs more, and on top of all of that, there was a real chance you might lose your job because the company you worked for couldn't afford its own energy costs. It was the economic equivalent of being punched from every direction. This period also shattered the intellectual consensus that had dominated economic thinking since the 1940s. Keynesian economics, the idea that governments could manage the economy through spending and monetary policy, had been the bedrock of post-war economic management. But stagflation wasn't supposed to be possible under Keynesian models. The failure of established economics to predict or fix stagflation opened the door to new schools of thought. Monetarism, supply-side economics, the Chicago School, ideas that would go on to reshape economic policy for the next 40 years. Whether those ideas were actually better is still hotly debated. But the point is that the oil crisis didn't just break the economy. It broke the framework we used to understand the economy. And on top of that, the inflation and the unemployment. Something called the misery index, the simple sum of inflation rate plus unemployment rate, hit its highest point in American history. Americans' confidence in their economic future cratered to levels not seen since the Great Depression itself. People genuinely didn't believe things were going to get better. And that psychological collapse was as damaging to the economy as the material conditions themselves. And there was no easy fix. The economic chaos that followed all but guaranteed the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States. But it wasn't just America. Across the developed world, whoever happened to be in charge when the oil prices hit was replaced with the other party. It didn't even particularly matter how much the sitting government actually had anything to do with the crisis itself. Voters wanted somebody different, and they were going to get it. Jimmy Carter in America, James Callaghan in Britain, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in France. The political casualties of the oil crisis stretched across the entire Western world. This is a pattern we've seen play out dozens of times throughout history. Economic pain leads to political change, regardless of whether the new people have any better ideas. In the USA specifically, inflation had become the problem. And because the US dollar was the world's reserve currency, there was enormous international pressure to get it under control. That was until Paul Volcker came along. Volcker was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. Essentially, he was handed a financial system that was on fire and told to do whatever it took to put it out. His solution was about as subtle as a sledgehammer. He raised interest rates. Not by a little bit, not by a reasonable amount that might gradually cool things down. He raised them to 20%. For context, the current rate cycle that most people have been complaining about peaked at around 5.5%. Volcker's Fed went to 20%. The man famously said he wanted to break the back of inflation, and he meant it literally. To understand how extreme this was, imagine your mortgage payment roughly tripling because the rate on your adjustable loan just went from 8% to 20%. That's what happened to millions of Americans. Now, this worked. Eventually, inflation did come down, but the cost was extraordinary. By making borrowing that expensive, Volcker essentially forced the economy into a deep recession on purpose. Businesses couldn't afford to take on debt. Consumers couldn't afford mortgages. Construction ground to a halt. Unemployment spiked to nearly 11%, the highest since the Great Depression. Car dealers and construction workers mailed him 2x4s and car keys to protest the fact that their industries had just been crushed. Farmers drove tractors to Washington. He reportedly received death threats. But he held firm, and slowly, painfully, the back of inflation was broken. Now, most people who know the Volcker story stop here. The brave Fed chairman made the hard call, took the hit, and saved the economy. End of story. But the thing about Volcker that doesn't fit neatly into the tough leader makes hard choices narrative, he was one of the few government officials in that entire era who was actually willing to accept being despised in the short term, to do what he genuinely believed was necessary for the long-term health of the country. That kind of willingness to absorb public hatred for a principle has become almost unheard of in modern politics, where elected officials and appointed technocrats alike seem far more interested in smoothing over short-term pain than making difficult choices. Volcker was genuinely hated while he was doing his job, and he simply didn't care. But it's not the end of the story, because 20% interest rates didn't just break inflation. They broke a lot of other things too. And this is where one of those long, echoing consequences of the oil crisis starts to become visible. Savings and loans institutions, or SNLs as they were commonly known, were essentially community banks that took in deposits from regular people and lent that money out as home mortgages. Simple, boring banking. The business model was straightforward. Take in deposits at, say, 5% interest, lend that money out as a 30-year mortgage at 8%, pocket the difference. It worked fine as long as interest rates stayed relatively stable. But most of these SNLs had locked in long-term mortgages at those lower rates. When Volcker jacked rates up to 20%, these institutions suddenly found themselves paying depositors far more in interest than they were earning on their existing mortgage portfolios. They were losing money on every single account. In desperation, many SNLs started making increasingly risky investments to try and make up the shortfall, lending money to speculative real estate developments, commercial ventures, even outright fraud in some cases. Congress didn't help. In a spectacularly ill-timed piece of deregulation, they loosened the rules around what SNLs could invest in, essentially handing over the matches to institutions that were already burning through their reserves. The result was this savings and loans crisis of the late 1980s and early 1990s, one of the most expensive financial disasters in American history up to that point, which eventually cost taxpayers over $130 billion to clean up. More than 1,000 S&Ls failed, several executives went to prison, and it all traces back to oil prices in Iran. Now, if this sounds like a pattern that should have been familiar by the time 2008 rolled around, you'd be right. The savings and loan crisis was in many ways a dress rehearsal for the global financial crisis 2 decades later. Financial institutions chasing returns to cover losses, deregulation removing the safeguards, and taxpayers left holding the bill when it all fell apart. The specifics were different, but the underlying structure was almost identical. All of this was also happening at what might have been the worst possible time for the United States and the West more broadly. The Vietnam War, which had been lost just 4 years earlier, had turned into a costly quagmire that demanded an enormous amount of military spending while delivering absolutely nothing in return. The war had eroded public trust in the government, consumed resources that could have been invested elsewhere, divided the country in ways that would take decades to heal, and also shook the image of the USA as an unstoppable global force. The breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s meant that the United States was no longer the de facto center of global trade that it had been since the end of World War II. There was now genuine uncertainty about the reliability of America as a trade partner. Most people think of 1971 as just the year Nixon took the dollar off gold, but the reality was far more disruptive than that. The whole system of fixed exchange rates that had provided stability and predictability for decades, but was now gone, replaced with floating currencies that made international trade more volatile and less certain. On top of all of this, America was facing rising competition from newly industrializing countries in Asia. Japan and South Korea in particular were eating into Western dominance in primary industries like steel, shipbuilding, and electronics. These countries had lower labor costs, newer factories, and governments that were actually supporting their industrial expansion with subsidies and trade protections. For American workers in heavy industry, this was devastating. Factories that had employed entire towns for generations were suddenly uncompetitive, and the jobs that disappeared were not coming back. Any one of these problems might have caused a recession eventually on its own. The Vietnam spending was unsustainable, the Bretton Woods collapse was destabilizing, the Asian competition was structural. But the oil crisis was the perfect catalyst to start the reaction. It was the spark that landed in a room full of kindling, which had been quietly piling up for years. Now, if this story so far has been mostly about how everything fell apart, the next section is about how the world started putting itself back together in a way that nobody really expected. Because by 1982, the problem was almost the opposite of what it had been just 3 years earlier. The world had a glut of oil. Remember all those countries that ramped up production to cash in on higher prices? Well, they never stopped producing. And with global economic activity significantly lower thanks to the recession, which Volcker's interest rates had helped create, demand for oil was dropping just as supply was surging. The result was a long, slow decline back toward pre-crisis prices. Not overnight, but steadily over the course of the 1980s. Now, this glut actually caused its own set of problems. Countries that had based their government budgets on high oil prices, particularly in OPEC, suddenly found themselves short of revenue. Some of them borrowed heavily to maintain spending, setting up debt crises that would play out through the 1980s and 1990s. But for the oil-importing countries of the West, falling prices felt like an enormous relief. The higher prices had also done something else that people hadn't anticipated at the time. They made it economically viable for other countries to start exploring their own oil reserves, even in locations that had previously been too expensive to develop. The North Sea is probably the best example of this. Britain and Norway had known about oil reserves under the North Sea for years, but the cost of drilling into deep, freezing, storm-battered waters had made it uneconomical compared to just buying cheap Middle Eastern crude. But when Middle Eastern crude stopped being cheap, suddenly those North Sea wells looked like very attractive investments. Britain went from being a net oil importer to being essentially self-sufficient in oil by the mid-1980s, which had massive implications for the British economy. And, not coincidentally, for Margaret Thatcher's political fortunes. Norway, however, took a very different approach to its oil windfall. Rather than spending all their revenues immediately like other oil-producing nations, Norway eventually created the Government Pension Fund in 1990, systematically saving oil reserves for future generations. While most oil-producing nations squandered their wealth in a burst of consumption, Norway built a fund that now generates hundreds of billions of dollars in annual returns. It's one of the rare examples of a country actually learning from the oil crisis and making structural decisions to insulate itself from future resource shocks. The same logic applied to deeper reservoirs, oil sands in Canada, and fields in West Africa and South America. Higher prices didn't just change behavior, they changed the geography of global oil production permanently. OPEC's share of global oil production actually fell during the 1980s, precisely because the high prices they'd engineered made it profitable for everybody else to start producing. Which is one of those delicious economic ironies where trying to maintain a monopoly creates the conditions that destroys it. Saudi Arabia in particular found itself in an awkward position. As OPEC's largest producer, it had been acting as the cartel's swing producer, cutting its own output to keep prices high, while other OPEC members cheated on their quotas and produced as much as they could. By the mid-1980s, the Saudis got tired of being the only ones playing by the rules and opened the taps. The resulting flood of oil crashed prices even further, creating chaos not just in other OPEC nations, but also in countries like the Soviet Union, whose economy was heavily dependent on oil exports. Some historians have argued that Saudi Arabia's decision to crash oil prices in the 1980s did more to destabilize the Soviet economy than any Western military spending. So, the oil crisis essentially created its own solution, at least from a supply perspective, which is one of those things that sounds reassuring until you realize how much damage was done in the meantime. But here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the long-term consequences of the oil crisis were not all bad. In fact, some of them might be among the most important economic shifts of the 20th century. The crisis lived up to its name and generally shocked the world into realizing just how catastrophically dependent it was on cheap energy to grow its economy. And people actually started doing something about it. Fuel efficiency in cars went from being an afterthought to a selling point almost overnight. In 1975, the US government introduced CAF standards, Corporate Average Fuel Economy, which, for the first time in history, required manufacturers to meet minimum fuel efficiency targets. The average fuel economy of American vehicles essentially doubled over the decade following the crisis, going from that embarrassing 13 miles per gallon we mentioned earlier to over 25 by the late 1980s. Japanese automakers, who had been building smaller, more efficient cars for years because Japan had never had cheap domestic oil, suddenly found themselves with the hottest products in America. Toyota, Honda, and Datsun went from being curiosities to being serious competitors to Detroit almost overnight. It was one of those rare moments where a crisis created a massive competitive advantage for the people who had already been doing the right thing, even if they were doing it for completely different reasons. This shift was so dramatic that it effectively killed the dominance of the big three American automakers for an entire generation. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler had spent decades building bigger and bigger vehicles, because that's what Americans wanted when fuel was cheap. When fuel stopped being cheap, they had nothing to offer, and by the time they caught up, the Japanese brands had already captured a permanent share of the American market. Homeowners started insulating their houses, replacing old heating systems and paying attention to energy costs in a way that they simply hadn't before. President Carter literally put solar panels on the White House in 1979, which Reagan promptly removed when he took office. Industry started treating energy inputs as a real cost, and more importantly, as a strategic vulnerability. If your business model depended on cheap oil, and cheap oil could disappear in a matter of months because of a revolution on the other side of the world, then maybe it was time to think about Plan B. Many of those alternative energy efforts evaporated once prices stabilized. Carter's solar panel investments were defunded almost immediately after Reagan took office. nuclear power expansion plans were abandoned. Research into synthetic fuels and other alternatives was deprioritized the moment oil stopped being visibly scarce. The lesson of the crisis, that we needed to diversify our energy sources, was learned in theory, but forgotten in practice the instant the financial pain subsided. It proved once again that even when a crisis teaches us the right lesson, we forget it the moment the immediate danger passes. Entire governments started building out contingencies. Strategic petroleum reserves, like the one in the United States that holds around 700 million barrels today, were either created or massively expanded, specifically in response to the lessons of the late 1970s. The International Energy Agency, which today coordinates energy policy between major consuming countries, was actually founded in 1974, specifically in response to the first oil crisis. By the time the second one hit, it was already warning governments that they needed emergency stockpiles. The idea was simple enough: if you can't prevent a supply disruption, at least have enough oil in storage to buy yourself time before the panic sets in. It was basically a national insurance policy against exactly the kind of crisis we've been talking about. But perhaps the most profound long-term consequence of the oil crisis was one that most people don't immediately connect to it. The global economy became far less industrial. And to be clear, this wasn't just about energy costs. The oil crisis changed the way entire economies thought about risk. If your economy was built around heavy industry, you were exposed to energy price shocks. If your economy was built around services, you were far more insulated. Governments and investors started to favor the sectors that were less vulnerable to the kind of disruption they'd just lived through. Now, the oil crisis was not directly responsible for this. The shift towards a service-based economy had been happening gradually for decades, but the crisis accelerated it enormously. Because when you stop to think about it, the biggest industries in the world today are not really what most people would think of as industrial. Technology, finance, media, and professional services are all far less dependent on burning fossil fuels to operate than steel mills, car factories, and petrochemical plants. A tech company's biggest energy expenses are data centers and office buildings. A consulting firm's biggest energy expense is business travel. A bank's biggest energy expense is keeping the lights on. These are all real costs, but they're a tiny fraction of what a steel mill or an aluminium smelter uses. So the crisis didn't create the service economy, but it made the old industrial economy significantly less competitive, significantly faster. Companies that could shift toward less energy-intensive business models had an enormous advantage over those that couldn't. And the countries that adapted fastest to this new reality were the ones that came out of the 1980s in the strongest position. But while the world was shifting away from heavy industry, there was a massive social cost that often gets overlooked. The Rust Belt as we know it today, cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland that had been industrial powerhouses, was essentially born from this era. Manufacturing jobs that had supported an entire generation of workers and built the post-war middle class simply vanished. Many of these cities that had been centers of prosperity became symbols of economic decline, and many of them have never fully recovered even decades later. The oil crisis didn't just reshape the global economy, it left entire regions and communities behind. Because while the world spent 4 decades reducing its dependence on fossil fuels for traditional industrial purposes, we might have quietly started building a new one. The explosion of cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and cryptocurrency mining has created an enormous and rapidly growing demand for electricity, much of which is being met by natural gas turbines. Data centers alone now consume more electricity than some small countries, and the largest tech companies are signing deals with power utilities that would have been unimaginable even 5 years ago. I genuinely hope that doesn't become a problem. But if you've been paying attention to the rest of this video, you probably already know how that story tends to play out. Anyways, now, the recovery from the oil crisis also had some rather notable political consequences. Specifically, it made certain world leaders look really good, even when their actual ideas were questionable. Ronald Reagan came to office in 1981, right at the peak of the economic pain. Inflation was still raging, unemployment was climbing, and people were genuinely angry. Over the next few years, as Volcker's interest rate medicine worked its way through the system and oil prices gradually fell back to more normal levels, the economy recovered. growth came back, inflation dropped, people felt better, and Reagan got the credit. Was this entirely fair? Not really. The recovery had more to do with Volcker's Fed policy, which Reagan had nothing to do with, and the natural easing of oil prices, which nobody in Washington controlled, than it did to any specific policy Reagan implemented. But politics is perception, and the perception was that Reagan had fixed the economy. This is actually a pattern with a name. Economists call it attribution bias. In political contexts, the tendency for voters to credit or blame whoever is in office for economic conditions that are largely outside their control. And the oil crisis era might be the single best example of it in modern history. Reagan didn't cause the recovery. He was simply standing in the right place when it happened. But the story of Reagan saved the economy became one of the most powerful political narratives of the 20th century. This narrative became so powerful that it reshaped American economic policy for the next 4 decades. Tax cuts, deregulation, and a general skepticism of government intervention became the default approach to economic management. Not because they were proven to work in this context, but because they happened to coincide with a recovery that was mostly driven by completely unrelated factors. And this wasn't unique to America. Margaret Thatcher in Britain and similar leaders across the developed world all benefited from the exact same dynamic. The oil crisis created the pain. Volcker-style monetary policy and falling oil prices fixed the pain. But the politicians who happened to be standing there when things got better took the credit. But there is something even more unsettling about this whole story that we haven't addressed yet. If total oil production was only down 4%, and the crisis still managed to reshape the entire global economy, change governments across the Western world, create a decade of stagflation, trigger a banking crisis, and accelerate the decline of heavy industry, then what does that tell us about how fragile the systems we rely on actually are? The sad truth is that this was largely a crisis of human nature rather than a genuine catastrophe of supply. The oil was still there, the wells were still producing, the tankers were still sailing. But panic, speculation, and political inaction turned a manageable disruption into a decade of economic pain. We've actually seen smaller versions of this same pattern play out multiple times since. The 1990 Gulf War caused a brief oil price spike. The 2008 financial crisis saw oil prices swing wildly. And of course, the pandemic lockdown of 2020 temporarily crashed oil prices to negative territory, meaning producers were literally paying people to take their oil because they had nowhere to store it. Each time, the same dynamic plays out. A disruption hits, panic amplifies it, the consequences ripple outward into parts of the economy that seem completely unrelated, and then, eventually, things settle down and everybody goes right back to doing exactly what they were doing before. The lesson of the 1979 oil crisis isn't really about oil at all. It's about how tightly wound our economic systems become when they're built around a single point of vulnerability, and how a relatively small disruption can cascade into consequences that last for decades. It's about how panic does more damage than the actual problem in most crises, how human nature turns a 4% supply drop into rationing and stagflation, and how the political fallout from economic pain almost never punishes the people who actually caused it. And, well, it's also about the fact that we've known all of this since 1979, and we keep doing it anyway. Not always with oil specifically, but the pattern repeats. We build complex, interconnected, globalized systems with very little redundancy, because redundancy is expensive and efficiency is profitable. And then we act surprised when a revolution or a war or a pandemic exposes the fragility that was there the whole time. Supply chains in the 1970s were built around the assumption that Middle Eastern oil would flow forever. Supply chains today are built around the assumption that Taiwanese semiconductors will ship forever, that Chinese manufacturing will stay cheap forever, that global shipping lanes will remain open forever. And the people making the decisions know this. They've read the history, they've seen the pattern. They just don't think it will happen to them. Now, if this video made you curious about the political fallout from all of this economic chaos, especially in the United States, we made a whole video about the rise and impact of Ronald Reagan that picks up almost exactly where this story leaves off. Go check that out if you want to see how the recovery from this crisis was used to justify an entire generation of economic policy that we're still living with today. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.